climate change has become about the politics of gesture. And I think that that's perhaps what Labor has done here, is that they see the issue of climate as a part of identity politics, right? Oh, we're climate warriors, we're climate activists, we're climate, we're for climate justice, all these climate fill in the blank. That is one of the ways that the voting public has been seduced by this idea. And how do you disabuse them of it? You pound them with the facts on the cost.
Now, for all of those who have not heard him before, you will understand why we were so excited to have Robert Bryce in our country. As I say, one of the clearest voices speaking facts in what is really a litany of lies told to us around the world by the political classes. But you might not know Mia Schlicht, who works for the IPA, and you've already been introduced to Adam, so I'll introduce Mia. Mia, you've been doing a lot of research in this area at the moment. One of the things that people don't see, we can begin to see some of the costs that are being borne by the prices in our electricity bill. Mm-hmm. But there are also the subsidies. So can you tell us a bit about the research that you've been doing on wind and solar and the subsidies, and where do those subsidies go?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So when it comes to, at the IPA, we had a bit of a sit down and we said, all right, so net zero is ingrained through our legislation, and it'll take a lot of work to take it down. So where can we start? How do we get people to care about this issue? And where you start is the costs, because there's a lot of people who go out there and they'll say that they support net zero, but then that support immediately is removed when you ask them to pay for it. So we did some surveying at the IPA and we found that less than half of the people that we surveyed were willing to pay a single dollar to prop up net zero policies, and 98% of those people were willing to pay $500 a year. So what we wanted to reveal is, well, if you're consuming electricity and you're paying for electricity, you're actually already propping up these renewable energy infrastructure. So we had a look at the LRET scheme, and basically what this does is it's an artificial market that the government has created to prop up wind and solar infrastructure. And how it works is wind and solar farms, and I'm hesitant to use the word farms because they're not farms, but that's the branding that the left has created. Each year they have to sell a certain number of certificates to energy retailers, and those energy retailers, they don't want to wear those excess costs. They pass that on to consumers. And so what we found was that in 2024 alone, the 50 largest wind and solar farms, they received $1.7 billion in subsidies through people paying their electricity bills. And to make matters worse, of that $1.7 billion, $1.2 billion went to foreign companies.
Yeah, and Adam, when we talk about the cost of this, that is one of the things that has to be sort of baked in, that people have to begin to understand. You talked about a figure of $9 trillion for Australia. Well, McKinsey's has done the research for the world. They're saying $10 trillion a year, every single year, yes, from now and through until 2050. At some point on the pathway to poverty, surely the people will revolt.
Yeah, look, I mean, the problem with these really big figures, and there's, trillions here, trillions there, and there's so many reports. For Australia, it was...
Pretty soon you're talking real money. Yeah, that's right.
But I don't think people really care, out there, consuming these figures. They just don't really understand what they mean. And often the industry itself, of course, sells these figures as a benefit. It's like, oh, this is an investment opportunity. So they don't even see it as a cost. They don't realise the opportunity cost. All that money could be spent on something else that's actually productive, that's actually beneficial, rather than this, kind of nonsense wind and solar. But anyway, just in terms of the project I did, I thought, look, it's it's probably worthwhile just to focus on what the federal government here in Australia is spending, and because it had been pretty negligible, frankly, because most of the costs of net zero, they are created by regulations, not actual government spending, and they're foisted on households and businesses in terms of the sorts of energy that they have to provide. But as I showed in that paper, I was actually shocked when I looked through all the budget papers, just the quantum and the number of programs too, not just the financial value, had just exploded since 2022, from that 1.7 billion a year to 9 billion. And they might say that's not a lot, but as I pointed out, it's the equivalent to what we spend on our Air Force every year. And so we have the current situation where the Labor government says we can't afford more on defence, we can't afford this, can't afford that. Well, there's $9 billion going to these hundreds of very confusing and overlapping projects. So I thought that was, was interesting to draw attention to that.
Okay, I should say to the panel, jump in at any time. The more I talk, the less successful this actually is. So treat it as a dinner party conversation with a very informed audience.
Well, since you said that, so the estimate of 9 trillion, 8 trillion, we had a meeting yesterday and I just whipped out my calculator. So call it 8 trillion and you have 27 million Aussies. That's $300,000 per Australian. And that's a number that I think you can deploy and put it on a bumper sticker. I mean, this is a number you need to use in the fight. But I also wanted to just disagree with Adam just a little bit about the press not covering this. So on Friday, we'll be here 2 weeks. We're leaving 2 weeks. So this is a week ago Monday in the Adelaide Advertiser, power price ripoff in South Australia, talking about the fact that solar at certain times is free, and yet consumers are paying higher prices. Here's in the Australian, when was this? June 10th, high price hydrogen bombshell, right? So I think, and here's, this was a good one. This was just last Friday. Criminal linked firms on nation's biggest wind farm. 13% of this is in the Financial Review, the AFR, last Friday. 13% of Victoria's gas budget gone in 3 days. So, in many ways, I think your press is in fact covering this. As a newspaper guy, I look at this and I think, hell yeah, they're covering it. But why? I guess my question: why aren't these kinds of things resonating with the policymakers?
Well, I think a massive issue that we have here in Australia is, and this came out in the most recent federal election, is mainstream Australians haven't been afforded the opportunity to actually debate this yet. We have bipartisan support for net zero, and that's meant that, and this happened in the 2022 election, the 2025 election, we haven't got out the nuts and bolts. But when you do start pulling it apart, that's where it falls apart. I think it's interesting to note that in the 2025 election, Labor did not mention any of their renewables plan. Chris Bowen was in witness protection. They kept him separate because they know that when you wheel him out, when you bring this stuff into the public domain, it falls apart.
Yeah, just like in the budget, the budget graph I showed, exactly the same. All those terms dropped off in the most recent budget because I think they're starting to realise this is not popular stuff, or it's not going to be.
Robert, I like the way that at some point it was like a Southern Baptist church. You were getting this call and response going.
Oh yeah,
you'll understand.
Can I have an amen?
And you can say, who is responsible for the disaster of Australia's energy policy in Australia at the moment? They will say. But it is actually a joint responsibility because all of the states are on a unity ticket. In fact, one of the worst people that we had in Australia was a guy called Matt Keane who worked for the Liberal Party. Yes. So just keep a few of these names handy.
Why didn't I know his name when I was talking? That's good.
The Australian audience. But speaking of you as an evangelist, this is the difference. I think what Adam is saying is people are not connecting the dots in the way that you do. Not here, not very many. So what will happen is there will always be an excuse for wind and solar. Yeah. When wind and solar isn't generating and there's a problem with prices, it will be the fault of everything else that is generating. If the lights go out, and soon enough they will, when a big coal-fired generator drops off the grid because wind and solar was resting on its shovels, Chris Bowen will come out and say, see, these old things are unreliable.
Oh, he said this. It was in the newspaper just yesterday. That he gave it. He was in.
Yeah, well, the Victorian Your Lawn power station had.
Yeah, right. He spoke today, right? But that was part of it. That the reason the power prices are going up is because of old coal plants. Okay, let's see. For decades, you ran coal plants and your power was cheap, and now you're shutting them down and your power is dear. Oh, gee, but it's the coal plant's fault, right? Yeah. But I think there's something else at work here, and I think it's important, and I think, Mia, I think, has, seen this. There is this idea around the sanctification of wind and solar as the goal, that there is an idea that because they are renewable, they are good. Right, but as my friend Jesse Ausubel has said many times, he said, wind and solar may be renewable, but they are not green. And I think that's a really key point. And that what Labor has done, and I think in the US we've seen this, and the Greens in Germany to some extent, that, and I've mentioned this before, but there's a very good article about Greta Thunberg recently in the National Review, and the writer talked about, how she's abandoned it now and she's all about Hamas, and I don't know, it's crazy. But he said that climate change has become about the politics of gesture. And I thought that that's a really keen insight into why it's politically appealing. And I think that that's perhaps what Labor has done here, is that they see the issue of climate as a part of identity politics, right? Oh, we're climate warriors, we're climate, activists, we're climate, we're for climate justice, all these climate fill in the blank. That is one of the ways that the voting public has been seduced by this idea. And how do you disabuse them of it? You pound them with the facts on the cost.
One of the other things that's happened too is that we have fed our young a diet of climate catastrophism, always painting the worst case scenario of things. And I'm very interested in this from you, because you represent this generation. And look, they've essentially replaced, it seems to me, the old gods with a new one. Everyone wants to do something about the environment. Everyone would want to do their bit. How do we get through a message to young women in particular that the world is not about to end?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And a bit of background about me is I studied science and law, and I majored in climate science. So I've heard it all. I've seen all the data, I've heard it all, and that's brought me here, so that'll tell you that much about the data. But it's a good point, and it's an important point, especially with young people, is we are constantly told this message that there is no cost too high when it comes to saving the environment. Because if we don't do something about it, the world will explode into a giant ball of flame tomorrow. And that's what our young people are told, and they're taught all through school, they're taught all through university. And it's this message that if you are a good person, you need to be doing something for the climate. And it's a fantastic branding exercise, because basically the result of that is no cost is too high. So when we bring out these numbers and we say it's going to cost you X, Y, Z, and they say, well, that's my duty. So this is where the work of the database comes in and why it's so important. So to tackle this moral high ground that these zealots of net zero have, is we've been visiting the communities who are actually affected by the rollout of renewables. And we've been going to regional communities. Peter Creighton has been leading this and has done a fantastic job covering this on her program. But we've been going to these communities and seeing what these companies are doing to them, and the stories are horrendous. There are stories of bullying, blackmail, underhanded tactics. And basically when you bring those stories to light, it shows you cannot feel good about this. When you see what these projects are doing to the heartland of Australia, the communities that prop up our national export market, you no longer can feel good about yourself for supporting renewable energy. And so with this database, the goal is to show these communities that they are not alone. Often what these companies will do is they'll share this message that, there's a bit of opposition, but it's sparse, it's small, it's minimal. We want to collect that data, display it clearly, and show that no, it's not. It's national, it's organised, and it is growing. And if you continue to push these policies, you will have a wall of communities banding together and fighting right back.
Right. And if I can add to that, because I've interviewed, hundreds of people in rural America and rural parts of Europe and Asia as well. What is key for them is to know they're not alone, and that there are other people like them, and that they can network with them and learn from each other. Mm-hmm. And that network effect is absolutely critical, and Facebook has been an important platform for these groups. If I can just add one quick point to what Mia was saying there as well about this belief system and the catastrophism. When you look at it and deconstruct it a little bit, it mimics a lot of Christian theology, right? That you have this idea of sin, right? That we've sinned, we've lived too well, and we've bitten from the apple. And nuclear is the ultimate apple, and we must avoid it, right? Because that's the ultimate technology. And the way forward is in fact the way backward, that we need to go back to the garden and go back to abandon hydrocarbons and of course stay away from nuclear, and go back to this pastoral kind of existence. And if you look at, one of the seminal works, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, it starts with, I can quote it directly, man once lived in harmony with nature. Yeah, we lived in harmony with nature, and our teeth fell out at age 15, and we were all dead by 22. Yeah, well, we were in harmony, it was great. But that is one of the modern, not the modern Bible, but one of the modern tomes that supports in the environmentalism, right, as a new form of belief at the same time that church-going has declined. So God is the earth, and the system of belief around sin and redemption is part of that, and it fits perfectly within that kind of Christian framework.
Oh yeah, as someone who spent more than 3 years in a Catholic seminary, it's got the lot, right, all the terms, right down to As a Catholic, you cannot eat meat on a Friday. Well, you will not eat meat ever. Right? So that's it. No more meat in this religion.
Fish for you forever.
Fish for you. No fish. We will make the food and feed it to you.
Just to slightly expand on, just to reiterate, and that's completely true. I think in this broadly post-Christian society, you're just realising that there is a desire for a religion which is inbuilt into humans.
Yeah.
And
this God-shaped hole in the heart.
It's just there. You know, we want something. We want some set of rules, something to live by, even though it is irrational. And you know, I hate to go back to COVID, but you know, it's my bugbear. But we saw the same religious fanaticism with the COVID rules. And note the word zero as well. COVID zero, net zero. Yeah. You know, that is a fanatical
number.
Zero
is an emotional number.
It's an emotional number. It's like eradication.
Coke
eradication.
Coke zero.
Yeah. And to eradicate, you know, that's Coke zero.
It's occurred to me. I didn't thought of it before, but Coke zero. Yeah.
Coke zero.
You can have all the soda you want at no cost.
No, but still, it's exactly the same, and I do hope net zero goes the same way intellectually as COVID zero did and has done.
Well, as Donald Trump said, I've never seen anyone thin drinking that Coke Zero.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So that's a mirage too. It's a mirage too. But anyway,
Adam, I want to actually take you on a little bit further on this note, though, because like, despite what people think about Australia, it is in fact one of the most urbanised countries on earth. And Adam, is the problem with us is that we are so disconnected from our sources of our wealth, our sources of energy and our sources of our food that we are now actively voting against them.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And just having spent 4 years in the US, you realise there is a very large rural community there as a proportion of the population, and that is a counterweight to the urban elites very much.
Yeah.
We don't have that here. I mean, despite the reputation that we have overseas, which has of course been completely undermined by COVID as the, you know, larrikins and kind of irreverent tough guys, that's been shown to be, you know, far from the truth. We are extremely urbanised, more than the Netherlands, I think, actually. If you look at the correct definition, certainly more than England, much more urbanised than England.
But isn't that national identity? I mean, in Australia, still about that kind of rural farmer and the cattle stations.
Tiny, but if you actually look at the numbers,
and you know,
but that's the image. But if you look at the
Crocodile
numbers,
Dundee
really
and all
tiny,
those guys.
and this is why I kind of worry about Australia's future a bit, because we are in this unusual case of extremely wealthy 5 or 6 cities, basically, and that's the whole population. And they're going to vote left. Well, I think too much for their own good until they realise it's too late. Whereas at least in Europe and in America, you've got these large regional areas which tend to be quite conservative, and they do not like.
Well, and I think that's a key point about the urban dwellers don't have to put up with the batteries or the high voltage transmission or the solar projects or the wind projects. They aren't farms, by the way. No, I was lectured many years ago in Canada as a Canadian woman. Don't you dare call them farms. They're projects, she said.
Or even the term renewables. They're not.
It's a terrible term, isn't it?
They're not renewables, and we need to switch that language. Robert's done a good job with this.
Great.
Yeah,
That's
Robert's
great.
switched to using alternative energy, and we need to start doing that here. That's a longer discussion, but that's just the branding around this. They've done a fantastic job at that. But on that point about how do you make the inner city people care about it, this is always comes up, and especially with young people. How do you make young people care? Well, the reality is until they start paying their electricity bills and they go through the roof, that's the only point they're going to start caring about this. And it's partly because representation of these regional and rural communities is completely absent. So if you take an example of this, the National Farmers Federation have said very minimal on this issue. And part of the reason for that is the CEO, or the former CEO, has recently been appointed the Energy Infrastructure Commissioner.
Oh, God.
Robert, take us through some of this around the world, because one of the stories that's never spoken about is the big finance which is behind big wind and big solar. And I know you've done a lot of work on that.
Yeah. Well, and Mia as well. I mean, what is it, another 1.7 billion, 1.2 billion
1.2
went to
billion.
foreign corporations. And this is what I see. Well, I talked about Osage County, Oklahoma. Well, this is an Italian company coming into rural Oklahoma. Why? They're after the tax credits. I mean, this is very simple. And, you know, it's the old rule in politics, follow the money. Cui bono, who benefits? So, particularly in the US, where as I've followed this, and I've, you know, tracked hundreds of cases now, the most aggressive of these climate change carpetbaggers, because that's what they are, pushing these wind and solar projects in rural America, they're foreign corporations. They're not domestic. So Shell, Invenergy, which is controlled by a Canadian company, Electricité de France, Electricité de Portugal. These companies have been rapacious in their fight and trying to intimidate rural communities to force them to take wind and solar projects they don't want. So, you know, after reporting on this for many years now, I don't think it's a cynical view, although I'm okay with cynicism. As the great Lily Tomlin said, no matter how cynical I get, I can't keep up. This push for alt energy is not about climate change, it's about money and who benefits. The rural Australians, rural Americans, rural people suffer. They take the hit with their property values, view sheds, tourism, et cetera. Who benefits? Big banks, big law firms, big business, and big NGOs.
And big environment.
Big NGOs. Big NGOs. I don't call them environmental groups either.
Yeah.
They're NGOs.
But why is Greenpeace and the Wilderness Society silent about land clearing on the Great Dividing Range? Why is that the case? And I keep saying this to people, try this as a mental exercise. You take the teal candidates, which are were funded by essentially big wind and big solar. So they're funded by power groups, right? And you turn them into the Santos candidates, no one would vote for them.
Yeah.
You know, if you drew a direct line between, hang on, there's a very big energy company which is pushing these people who are pushing my profit line in what they're doing, well, they now exist in our politics and they're seen as the virtuous ones, which I find bewildering, and young people are voting for them.
Well, yeah, it's a branding exercise, and they've done a fantastic job at it. And until you start picking apart every single element where this falls down, whether it's the costs, the harm to the environment, or even the damage to our national security, that's a huge element of this. So even just breaking down the fact that we dig up all this coal, we then export it to China. China then uses this coal to
build solar panels,
to power their energy system, to build our solar panels and our wind turbines, which we then buy off them to bring here and then to create our power system. And we could have just used the coal in the first place. Like, it doesn't make any sense, but young people aren't told this. It's not broken down, and we've got to start there.
So how do we break
just to slightly extend that, just in terms of there's a perception that big fossil fuel companies are the evil ones pro fossil fuels, but my sense is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you have BP being beyond petroleum, and they try to advertise their green credentials, their various green credentials. Well, I think they quite like this kind of green net zero stuff because it doesn't massively restrict the supply of fossil fuels, and so the prices go through the roof, and so they encourage it.
It's an interesting thought, but I
don't have empirical evidence, but that's just what I think is going on.
Well, two thoughts come to mind. One is this idea about sin and the devil, right? And the demonization of big oil has been ongoing, right? In the U.S., we have ongoing lawsuits against the big oil and gas companies because of climate change, right? That individual, like counties, I think in Multnomah County, Oregon, is suing, a number of oil companies for climate change, right? So this demonization of the oil and gas industry in particular has been one of these ways to identify the enemy, right, and the evildoer, right, in this kind of Christian tradition. But in terms of seeing this, where the positive trends are, what has happened in the U.S. now, some of this is due to Trump, of course, but some of it is due to higher interest rates and the bad economics of offshore wind. You see BP dumping wind. You see Equinor dumping wind. You see Shell dumping offshore wind. So they're starting to sober up as well because their shareholders are saying, why are you dilly-dallying with all this junk? You're an oil and gas company. You make more money doing oil and gas than you do this alternative energy. So I do see a change that's very positive that's being driven primarily by shareholders saying, we bought your shares, we want a return on our investment.
I mean, do you see that young Australians can be reached in this debate? They have been fed for such a long time, such essentially a diet of doom, and that this is the thing that gets me about this debate is that climate change is a problem. It's not an existential problem. Net zero is a target. It's not even a policy, but we're talking about a policy response to a problem. We need to start separating these things. And how do we go about doing that with a younger audience?
Well, I think to start with is we actually need to start having a debate, and our political leaders need to step up, because right now there is no debate. There is no political party willing to get out there and say, let's withdraw from net zero. Let's start there. And that's how you'll open up the conversation with young people. Young people aren't stupid. They'll listen to politics. There's this idea that young people aren't engaged in politics. They are. But when your political leaders aren't willing to step up and have that debate, how do you expect young people to follow?
Yeah, if you don't have... Just in the last few... Oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, no, sorry.
Just in the last minute or so, Robert, because tell us about what's happening in the rest of the world, because in fact, energy consumption in the United States was pretty flat for quite a long period of time.
Yeah.
Then along comes the data centre. So tell us about what's happening with energy consumption in the United States, and if we want to be part of the AI revolution, what will be needed?
Well, first, it was just 2 days ago, wasn't Amazon announced a $13 billion data center expansion here in Australia, right? And they said they were going to build a bunch of solar panels and build solar plants. It's
And a diesel generator.
It's obligatory, right? They have to say solar and data. But it's an open question whether you have enough juice to accommodate them. And what is big tech doing? And I've seen this in many times, and it's just a fact. Big tech has effectively unlimited amounts of money. And so they're going to build their own grids. And that's what we see in Texas. My nephew, I'm very proud of him, he works for Williams. It's a big pipeline company based in Tulsa. They're a gas company. They just did a $1.6 billion deal with a data center project in Ohio, a gas company. So all of the data center build out in the US is going to be fueled by natural gas. It's just all of it, because these big tech understands 24/7, 365 AI, you're not going to run it with wind and solar and batteries and unicorn farts and fairy dust. It's not going to happen. So they're building gas and as much as they can. Yes, they're talking about nuclear, but that's far in the distance still. So that's in the US, but still globally, in particular, electricity demand continues to rise, particularly in the developing world and particularly in China. I mean, it's just the growth in electricity demand in China and India, where economic growth and electricity demand go hand in hand. I think in India now, economic growth is 7% a year, 7 to 8% a year. Their electricity demand is skyrocketing.
Well, look, Robert's done a lot of singing for his supper. I can say that since he arrived in Australia, he's been through Perth and he's gone through Melbourne and he's come here now. I think you've been through Brisbane as well. So typically we bring a guest to Australia, flog them for long enough till they recover from jet lag, and then we send them home, which unfortunately we are sending you too soon. And as bird watchers, you really need to spend more time in Australia, because at least we have magnificent birds. But I'll leave you with this thought. In an event organised by Victorians, the worst sports and the worst ideas on energy all come out of Victoria.
That's true.
This is a truth universally accepted by this unbiased audience in New South Wales. And at some stage, someone's going to tell us what the score is against Queensland. But thank you so much for coming. Can you please thank Robert first? Thank you so much. Thank you, Mia, because, again, as an ageing old man, it is good to see a young female voice in this debate. And a highly intelligent and articulate one. Adam has always been a rock, so please thank him. I'll give one short ad. I've also set up a Substack site called Powerlines. It's going to be mostly on energy security and national security, and I'm keeping it as open as possible because this is a debate that we must have. Thank you so much for coming tonight.